Hello, and thank you for joining us in one of our presentations for the Parent and Info series. I'm Adrienne Higgins, one of the Youth Services Librarians at Cedar Mill. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Julia Rossi. Dr. Rossi's clinical areas focus in working with children, adolescents, and family systems in the treatment of trauma, grief, and emotional dysregulation and identity exploration. I am also introducing Dr. Karina Peters. She specializes in children, adolescents, and family work as well. Dr. Peters uses a multicultural lens in treatment, tailoring interventions to the unique needs of each client. Both of our experts today are currently working at the Children's Program in Portland. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so
much.
Thank
you, Adrienne. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're happy to be here.
I think tailorizing should be a real word. So I think you just coined a new word.
Thank you.
Sounds very official.
Yeah, so go ahead, Julia.
No, go ahead, Karina.
As Adrienne mentioned, Julia and I will be talking about trauma and grief in youth, and more specifically honing in on how you as supporting adults can facilitate healing and growth in your kids and teens.
We'll be talking a lot about parents, but because parents sort of hold that most critical role in terms of supporting kids and teens in healing from grief and trauma. However, a lot of this information can be applied to teachers and other supportive adults in a child's life. So we have how supporting adults, we're mostly going to be talking about parents, but just know that if you're a teacher or a coach or anyone else working with children and teens in this capacity, this can apply to you as
well. So as Adrienne mentioned, Julia and I have been working at the children's program for about 5 years. My primary role at the clinic is to provide therapy for kids and families. My age group that I would call my niche for a while was from 4 years old to 12, although a lot of my caseload has now aged up. So I go all the way up to 19 to my surprise. And I like to say that I'm a feelings doctor. So I'm a doctor of big feelings, which means anxiety, which means emotional dysregulation, grief, loss, trauma. And I also have a little specialization in adoption.
And I would say Adrienne did a great job of summarizing and introducing us. So I will just add that I tend to specialize in working with teens and young adults. So from kind of middle school through the college years is sort of my area of expertise. So today we've sort of broken things down in terms of our presentation today. We'll first be talking to you about stress and trauma and sort of what are the differences and how to identify trauma symptoms in your youth. And then we'll move on to talking about grief in a similar capacity. And then the second half of the presentation will be about how parents or supporting adults can help their youth navigate these symptoms and move towards healing. And then we'll also talk about when to know that your child might need some additional professional help and what to look for when you're looking for that. All right, so we're kicking it off with stress and trauma. So the word trauma is used often these days in varying degrees. So we thought it would be really helpful just to talk about what we mean when we say trauma, how it differs from stress, sort of how they're connected and how we conceptualize it in the world of psychology. So first, it's important to think about stress as not necessarily a bad thing. So we think about stress and trauma on a bit of a continuum, with trauma sort of being on the most severe end, being sort of, to be a little reductive, big stress. So a big stressful incident. Stress in and of itself is not a bad or harmful thing. Stress is just the natural reaction your body has when changes or challenges occur. We, as humans and all species, really need stress in order to learn, to grow, to evolve. And so it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's actually a good thing. but just in moderation. Where it becomes sort of problematic or dangerous for us as humans is when the stress itself exceeds our capacity to cope, or exceeds the resources we have to cope with it, or we perceive it to exceed those resources. So there's a lot of research out there. I won't go into the nitty gritty about sort of the mindset we have towards stress, and how we perceive it, in addition to kind of what the stressful event is. So our body has this sort of natural stress response system that is, again, to kind of reduce it to simpler terms, is the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is kind of our fight or flight response. So we perceive a threat or a stressful experience, and our sympathetic nervous system kicks in. So our heart rate gets pumping. Our heart sends blood to our appendages to either fight or flee. All of our systems prepare for a response to trauma. Once we're able to sort of cope with that trauma or shore up our resources and respond to that trauma or regulate ourselves in regards to that stress, then our parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. And that is the system that sort of calms us down, reverses all of those systems, reverses that cortisol, that stress hormone that's going through our bodies, and helps us kind of recover from that stress. The problem is when stress is prolonged, a stressful incident is prolonged, or when we experience stress at this sort of chronic level and our parasympathetic nervous system never really gets a chance to kick in. So we're kind of stuck in that fight or flight mode, and we're stuck with those stress hormones, that cortisol, and that's when that starts to do damage, physical and mental damage to our systems. So it's all about sort of how do we, this is really important as parents, because how do you help your child respond to stress? How do you help them shore up their resources in order to cope with the stress so that they can sort of come back down, and learn from it and grow from it? We also separate out in psychology sort of little T trauma and big T trauma. So what we mean by big T trauma are those sort of big, major traumatic events. They either are life-threatening or sort of pose a major safety threat to someone, or you witness someone else experiencing a major threat to their safety. And those are sort of those big events like, active combat or exposure to sort of graphic aspects of a loved one's death, or physical abuse or sexual abuse or assault, those types of things. Little T trauma is more about those kind of bigger, kind of distressing personal events, or high conflict in the home growing up, those types of things that don't rise to the level of what we would in psychology classify as sort of a trauma with a big T.
Yeah, and I think these things are just good to have definitions for and understand, for lack of a better term, the symptoms of each term, so that then when an event comes up, because there will be an event that comes up, you can then identify it and then know how to tackle it, which we'll talk about a little bit later in our presentation. So now that we've kind of have the definitions laid out, I wanted to talk about specifically what Dr. Karen Purvis from Texas Christian University coins as like the 5 Bs of trauma. And these 5 Bs of trauma are the ways that trauma impacts us across the age span. One of the things that is important to know is also how the brain develops. One of the things I like to teach parents and caregivers is what you see over here on the right, which is the hand model of the brain. The way that the brain develops is just important to know in thinking about how trauma affects the whole person, is from the bottom up. So you have your brain stem, and then you have your emotional brain, and then you have your thinking brain. And the way that is coined from Dan Siegel. So the way that Dan Siegel likes to talk about it is this part of your arm is your brain stem. This is typically done developing by the time you're born in utero. This is this part of your brain, the brainstem, is made to control all of your survival instincts. So what Julia was talking about earlier, that fight or flight, this is that part of the brain. Then you have your thumb, which is the amygdala, and it's the emotional brain, your limbic system, and it's right in the middle of your brain. And then you have the cortex, which is this is the front of your brain. The amygdala, or the emotion brain, this is done developing by age 5. I like to joke around with my friends who have littles that that's why you see 3 and 4 year olds losing their ever loving mind emotionally, is because this part of the brain is really going crazy. And then the cortex, the frontal lobe, is done developing at age 25, and this is the thinking brain. All parts are affected by trauma, but when we're thinking about the unconscious effects of trauma, like things that we can't control, it's mostly survival brain. So when we're talking about the brain itself, um, when trauma happens, it forces the brain to then organize around survival. So that's the fight, flight, or freeze, making anything that's like a higher level learning really, really difficult. Then we have the body, and trauma is stored physically. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the book, like the body keeps the score, and that's very, very true. The nervous system gets stuck on high alert, and it affects a lot of things like sleep, digestion, and physical responses. Then we have the biology, which is the chronic stress we talked about before. Um, and this part too is important to know that trauma can affect hormones, it can affect immune function, definitely mood regulation. We have beliefs, which is those thought patterns. When a traumatic event happens, it really, especially for kids and teens, as they're still continuing to learn about the world, a lot of their beliefs about the world are then put into question. And then, as a response, beliefs about themselves are put into question. So then all of these things are usually manifested in what we see in behavior, which can be seen as acting out, or defiance, or really fear-based, like survival responses. And so what I really want us to talk through today, and again, we'll touch on it later in the slides, is that behavior for both kids and teens is often indicative of a need that's unmet. And so if we can be curious about the behavior while also keeping in mind these other parts, especially when trauma occurs or when we're thinking about trauma and stress, that can only work in our benefit as caregivers. So, my thing. Um, I mentioned this a little bit already, but just in a little bit more detail written out here. For children specifically, they have difficulties regulating their basic emotions. Um, what you'll see as a symptom too of effects of trauma will be like more somatic, so stomach aches, headaches. Um, for behavior, like I said, the acting out. For youngers, it usually looks like clinging, or avoiding. So a lot of times you'll see it more in imaginative play. It's a less direct for kids. And what they'll do is they'll show you instead of telling you. So our job, again, as caregivers and as people who are attempting to be with children who have experienced hard things, is really to be curious and to ask questions to ourselves about, okay, what is the unmet need of this behavior? They have a stomach ache, they have a headache. Why? Like, what, did a hard thing happen recently? Is it that they ate something weird? So just keeping that lens of curiosity, to be able to parse out again what the need is and then how to meet that need. I think this is you, Julia.
Oh, I didn't. The slides look so similar. I thought we were still on the children. The alignment is really great. So I will be talking a little bit about how the 5 Bs of trauma affect teens. And again, I don't want to, some of this is a little repetitive, so I'll just kind of highlight some key differences with adolescents. But the brain is developing rapidly in adolescence. There's a lot of big changes, and particularly in terms of the Center for Executive Functioning and sort of impulse control, as well as emotion regulation centers of the brain. And so you see a sort of a big impact on this area with trauma symptoms. So you'll see maybe some increased risk taking, really kind of up and down mood, or significant differences in terms of increased irritability and anger, maybe some poor judgment, and a lot of challenges with concentration. So you see this show up a lot in terms of school performance for kids, for teens who are experiencing trauma symptoms. In terms of the body, you see sort of impacts on sleep hygiene, and those kind of altered stress hormones. Some of the same kind of somatic complaints that you see in younger kids, although probably generally less. In terms of what I mean by somatic complaints is sort of physical complaints, headaches, stomach aches, aches and pains, that sort of thing. And again, this is just sort of compounded by what's already happening in the teenage brain in terms of changes that come along with puberty and adolescent development. Behavior, you can see what we call internalizing behaviors as well as externalizing behaviors. So internalizing behaviors might be just thinking about a kid kind of turning inward. So isolating more, withdrawing from friends and family, maybe having challenges with school, or a kid who may have been a sort of active participant in class, sort of withdrawing and drawing into themselves more. Challenges with romantic relationships, potentially some self-injury in more extreme circumstances. And then those externalizing behaviors are going to be more of that risk-taking, substance use, or unhealthy sexual activity, or risky sexual activity, driving fast or driving while under the use of substances, that type of risky behavior. And then beliefs are a big component of trauma symptoms, sort of the impact in distorting beliefs, but also particularly at this time of development, where, as you may remember from being a teen yourself, it's a major sort of dynamic time for developing your identity. And with that comes along beliefs about yourself and others and about the world. And so trauma can have a very distorting impact on that. And that can sort of manifest in terms of kind of heightened internalized shame and self-doubt, difficulty with trusting others, and negative beliefs about what the future will hold. So those are kind of the major things that I wanted to bring out in terms of adolescent impact on adolescents with trauma.
We're going to switch gears just a little bit to grief. You'll see that a lot of the things we've already talked about, with symptoms of trauma, symptoms of stress, overlap with grief symptoms as well for kids and adolescents. One thing I wanted to highlight here, because I thought the definition was helpful, because all of us either have experienced some level of grief or will. And so I think having, what the American Psychological Association quantifies as grief is important. So grief is the natural, in bold, acute emotional and psychological anguish that accompanies a significant loss, most commonly the death of a loved one. It is the internal, subjective experience of bereavement, encompassing a wide spectrum of intense emotions, physical distress, and cognitive changes. I wanted to highlight this because one thing that I just want to mention and really kind of dial into is that there is no linear, universal way to grieve as adults, as kids, and as teens. And so what we'll be talking about in this section is more of this generally what we see, and also keeping, the little asterisk in the corner of everybody is made very uniquely. And so everybody, kids and teens, will grieve differently.
So we'll just touch briefly on different kinds of grief. It's important to think about grief as, we think of the sort of most intense aspects of it in this sort of acute grief stage. But grief doesn't necessarily kind of go away after that point. So when we talk about acute grief, we mean that sort of initial intense reaction to loss. and those pretty intense emotions. This will look differently for kids. So Karina's going to talk a little bit about that next. But we sort of think of this as sort of the initial aftermath of a loss. And then when we talk about integrated grief, this is sort of that natural adaptation to loss. And it doesn't mean, again, that the grief just goes away and we're fine and we're quote unquote healed. The healing process is really sort of a lifelong process. And this is particularly true for kids and teens because as they hit different developmental stages of their life throughout adulthood, that grief is going to affect them differently and they're going to be processing it in a different way. So it's never something that just sort of like, even if you take your kid to therapy and they, process their grief and then they're done with it. So integrating grief is really about that. Yes, return to normal functioning, but ability to sort of incorporate the loss and the meaning of that loss and the meaning of that person into their kind of daily life. When we talk about chronic grief or sort of prolonged grief, again, we're not talking about grief that goes on longer because that's just grief in general, but this idea that a person is sort of stuck in that acute grief stage and they're not really able to move forward and they're not able to make meaning and they also might have difficulty around just reminiscing about someone. So just wanted to kind of point out those aspects and then we'll talk more about sort of grief in kids and teens in these next couple of slides.
Yeah, so as Julia mentioned, grief symptoms in kids varies. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, there is not one size fits all. One of the most important um, or the most important thing to know about kids and grief is most of the time they do what we call puddle jumping. And so they can be intensely sad one minute, angry, really talking to you about the loss, talking to you about how upset they are. And then maybe a millisecond later, they're talking about what they did at school, or they're talking about their favorite ice cream. And so they go back and forth as a way to prevent emotional overwhelm. The way that I like to talk to the parents of my clients about this is it's in doses. This can be very confusing for parents, especially when you are a parent who is trying to be attuned to your kid and you're trying to understand how they're feeling about the loss and you really want to be with them in it. I think the mistake that we make as adults, because it's how we process, is like, well, let's talk about it until you don't need to talk about it anymore. And kids cannot do that. And so a lot of times it's really attuning instead to dipping in and dipping out, and knowing that that's okay and that there is a really high likelihood that your child will bring it up again and dip in and dip out in the same way. Um, if that is not happening, or if you're seeing more behavior or I guess maladaptive ways of coping with the grief, it might look like an increased tantrum, increased irritability, a lot of repetitive questions. It also could look like regression and using baby talk or difficulty sleeping, sometimes thumb sucking to self-soothe. Again, kids, their play is their main language. And so a lot of times you might see reenacting the loss through play or using imaginative stories to make sense of it. Very similar to what we talked about earlier with trauma symptoms for kiddos. Same thing with physical, right? There's usually some kind of a stomach ache or a headache, and then magical thinking. So kind of overlapping with the beliefs of trauma, though a little different, is a lot of times kids, in trying to make sense of it, will think that they did something to cause the loss. That maybe they thought something or they used a certain word that caused it, and or maybe they were mean one time. If they lost a sibling, they're mean one time to their brother, and that's what did it. And so really sitting with, allowing the emotions to be there, and again, dipping in, dipping out, is the best way to kind of understand, like, oh, my child is processing and this loss is affecting them in a profound way.
I think another thing that can be confusing about that puddle jumping, method is that sometimes parents will say like, "Is my, maybe my kid's totally fine," but it's hard, especially when you as parent yourself is also experiencing the loss. If it's the loss of a family member,
Mhm.
it can be very bewildering of like, how are they not affected by this, or how are they okay? I'm not okay. And it's not, it's just simply a different process. And um, that's another reason why parents are in such a critical role to helping kids, is that sometimes in therapy, a kid comes in and they're not wanting to jump in the puddle, they're just not
Mhm.
there at that moment. And, as therapists, we deal with that, and we approach it in different ways, but being, you're there with them, and you're often there when it does come up, when they're willing to dip in. And so being attuned to them, and we'll talk more about that, is so critical to be able to go in the puddle with them in that moment, and then be able to come out with them. You do see a little bit of that with teens still, that kind of dipping in and dipping out. But teens, their brains are developing to the point where they're better able to understand sort of the permanence of a loss, and they're maybe dealing with the kind of more complex emotions. It's sort of somewhere between how kids and how adults deal with grief. They're sort of along that continuum. They're also, though, as you may remember from when you were a teen, dealing with that sort of pressure to fit in and to belong. And so sometimes outwardly grieving can kind of come into tension with that just desire to like be normal and be like the other kids, and be focused on the same things that the other kids are focused on. And so sometimes that sort of part of that dipping in and dipping out process is um, sometimes teens will sort of shore up and kind of push down the feelings because they want to either not burden you with it, or burden other people, or burden their friends with it. If it feels like my friends won't understand, they've never gone through something like this, um, I'm just gonna pretend like I'm okay and keep moving. You do see a lot of that with teens. And so that sort of side door approach, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on, of knowing kind of how to talk with your teen about this in a low pressure way, can be a really useful way of helping them navigate the grief. Um, in terms of maybe some differences in how teens or young adults deal with grief, you'll see some of that kind of internalizing and externalizing symptoms. Again, as Karina mentioned, part of the reason why we do trauma and grief is there is quite a lot of overlap, and sometimes there is traumatic grief
Mhm.
as well. And so you see a lot of these overlaps in terms of the symptoms that may come out, particularly in that acute grief stage. You might see some social withdrawal of sort of pulling away. Again, that can be for a myriad of reasons, whether that's that the parent's own grief is too intense for them, and so they're sort of pulling away, or they fear that their grief is going to make their parents' grief worse. There's a lot of that thinking going on during adolescence, or pulling away from friends who just don't seem to understand, or who don't have a sense of, you know, this new sense of mortality, and all of these big questions and thoughts that teens who are experiencing grief are going through. You might see more of that risk taking that we talked about earlier, and some of those identity challenges, just because, again, this is kind of where the teen brain is at. All right, so we're going to move on to how you can help as parents, how you can help your teens and kids handle these big, big life events. So, Karina and I can talk about this till the cows come home. So, in the interest of time, I'll try to kind of focus on the highlights here. We'll have our contact information at the end. We have lots of resources in terms of all of these things. So if you feel like you have unanswered questions or want to know more, you're always welcome to reach out to us so we can send you further resources. But the critical part, again, that parents can play is establishing, both with grief and with trauma, establishing a sense of safety and security and predictability. These are really key to a child or a teen's ability to process through and heal from trauma and loss. The number one predictor of how a child copes with stress is how a parent copes with stress. So this is obviously very crucial when the stressor, the trauma, or the loss has impacted the family system. So the parent themselves is going through a similar thing. Obviously, that's very important, but just in general, your ability to regulate and attune to your child will go forever.
Miles, miles.
Miles and miles, infinite
Yeah.
distance in terms
Hmm.
of helping your child. So when we talk about attunement in this first bullet point here, attunement is that ability to kind of see where your child is at, detect where they're at emotionally. So being able to kind of pick up on their cues and see them on their level. And a lot of this, like, you as a parent, you know your child the best. And so you're able to know when something's off with your child, or you may know what they are like when they're kind of holding on to something, or when they're, with teens, this may come, like, they may kind of sidle up to you when it's time for bed, and that's when they want to talk, or they may be most likely to talk with you when you're in the car going somewhere and you're kind of
Hmm.
side by side, but you're not face to face. So this ability to attune and kind of pick up on your kids' cues is really, really crucial, and is really that first step. Um, and then that co-regulation piece. So when we were talking about that stress system, um, as a parent, you are so key in your child's ability to regulate. And some of that comes with, teaching them the skills themselves or doing it with them, whether that's like, hey, let's go for a walk. Like, I'm feeling really kind of sad, or I'm feeling really kind of stressed out, or I'm noticing that you're feeling, you're kind of buzzing over here, and I wonder if, this big event is impacting you, or if, upcoming finals, whatever it is. Let's go for a walk. Let's kind of
Hmm.
like get some of this anxious, nervous energy out. So that ability to kind of see them and suggest something to them or do something with them that helps them regulate. And then
I do
that
want
connect. Go ahead.
I do want to mention really quickly that with the attunement and co-regulation, it's also okay to not say anything and instead do together. So if your kiddo is somebody, or your teen is somebody that really doesn't like that like direct nature of attunement and co-regulating, even just noticing that and mirroring. So whatever it is that they're doing, if they're on their phone on the couch, you sit next to them on the phone with your couch, or on the couch with your phone. Or if it's like they want to go for a walk or a bike ride, then you join in. That's another way to attune and co-regulate.
Yeah. So when we're talking side door, like being on your phone next to your kid and then just kind of showing them a funny reel, or making a comment and kind of joining in their world, that's a great way to kind of enter in through the side door. So that front door approach would be like, hey, I noticed you're super stressed. Do you want to talk about it? Right. And some teens may be open to that at different times, and some may be really resistant to that. So really using your knowledge of your own child to know kind of what they respond to is obviously very important. And then that connection piece is just increasing that sense of connection in your family, and whatever it is you do to connect, whether that's having dinner together or watching movies together, or um, chatting about your day, or baking, whatever it is that you all use to connect, really kind of leaning on those tools in the aftermath of trauma and grief is very
And
important.
I think especially in this first bullet point, like Julia said, we could talk about this till the cows come home. And the reason for this is because it's so, so, so important. It is the foundation of healing in the context of grief and loss and stress. And so to be able to really dial in or focus, or I guess prioritize this attunement, co-regulation, and connection, because if there's something that happens on a biological level, which, as you heard before, the biology really is affected when a traumatic event or grief or anything comes up. Um, this is the stuff that like you I want to say you can't teach, but it just happens automatically when you're attuning, co-regulating, and connecting. There's so much under the surface that is crucial for that feeling of safety and security.
Another aspect that's really important to keep in mind is keeping your routines. So I think sometimes parents don't really know what to do when a big event has happened, or a big loss has happened. It can feel kind of crazy to just like jump back into the normal daily schedule, but this is what's going to anchor your child. And so that sense of like, I know the structure of my day, I know what to expect. Um, that kind of return to normalcy is really important. And it doesn't mean invalidating what just happened or ignoring or dismissing that or pushing it under the rug. It just means that you're helping provide that sense of structure and safety and predictability for your child that is that will be their anchor in that time. That being said, it's important to have some flexibility in that. So that's, that's not like you go to school 5 days a week and you go from start to finish and you can't take breaks, you have to stick with the schedule. It's having some flexibility in there. So what that might look like is having a conversation with your kid about like, do you feel ready to go back to school? And chances are they're going to be kind of leading that charge of return to normalcy, and kind of talking through, okay, what's our plan B if you're really like, how do you know if you really can't handle it today? And who can be your point person at school that you can go to and just say, hey, I'm having a really hard time. I need a break. I need to call my mom, whatever that is. And then going to soccer practice, and let's make sure we're cluing in the coach to what's going on, and they know what you need, if things are getting to be too much. So you're kind of having that sense of flexibility around, yes, things may change or you may need some added support, and what is our plan for that? So that's that kind of balance of routine with some flexibility. It's kind of similarly, when we talk about scaffolding in psychology, you think about a building that has that scaffolding, right? So the idea is that your child may need more help at certain points, whether that's because they haven't really developed much of their own coping skills to begin with, or because things are so hard, you're kind of providing more support earlier on, kind of helping teach them the skill, or checking in with them more, or checking in with the other supporting adults in their life. And then as your child shows that they're kind of healing or better able to regulate on their own, you're kind of stepping back and giving them that space to be able to do that. What we mean by containment is if there's been a big traumatic event, say for instance, an active shooter at school or in a public place, what we mean by containment is it's important that your child knows what's going on and has some information, but that it's developmentally appropriate and that it's not providing unnecessary trauma trigger. So they're not watching the news on loop, the news coverage about the shooter or that information. You're giving them the information that they need, but you are containing and protecting them from unnecessary exposure to more traumatic material. So you are sort of that container, and you're also helping them kind of step back. If it's a teen who's sort of scrolling information, helping them kind of put the brakes on that, and preventing unnecessary exposure to that.
With the providing scaffolding and containment piece, kind of going back to what we were talking about with the symptoms of trauma and grief, there is this perceived regression. And so a lot of times I know parents, caregivers, teachers will get frustrated at a kid who was able to do something and now is demonstrating that it's a little bit harder. And so when thinking about scaffolding, it's also thinking about regulation for you as a caregiver and noticing, seeing, attuning to the need of the child in front of you. And then even if they were able to do whatever it is before. Go to bed by themselves without help, brush their teeth without needing you there, providing scaffolding of like, okay, well, like little by little of like, I will be brushing teeth with you. Okay, you've mastered that. Now let me stand by the door, because what we are looking for again is establishing that safety security at a body level, which when negative things happen, that's really the body that is saying we're not safe.
I think we've touched mostly on the rest of these sort of throughout. When we think about rituals or traditions, again, that kind of goes back to that sense of connection and within the family system and that sense of predictability. So I know, when we sit down for dinner, we ask about roses and thorns. What was the best part of your day? What was the last part of your day? I know the first time I see my mom in the morning, she's gonna say this certain thing to me, or when I go to bed at night, she's gonna say, like, having that sense of like these are our routines or our rituals that solidify our family cohesion and culture and tradition, just sort of amping those up, or creating new ones with your child to just really restore and beef up that sense of this is my safe place. I know what to expect. I'm loved. I'm cared for. I'm protected here. When we were talking about that kind of good stress, it's important to, in moments of stress or trauma, also the attunement process is knowing when your child is still kind of within their window of tolerance. And what I mean by that is they have demonstrated to you that they do have the tools to cope, or they're, reaching out to their friends appropriately and seeking support and connecting with them on that. Or you see these signs that, like, yes, they are under stress and they have negative emotions because this is going to happen with grief and trauma, but they're coping with it and they're able to seek the appropriate resources, making sure that you're not jumping in and rescuing in those moments. Because again, stress can be good. Like, it's important that your child and your teen are learning from these experiences and growing from them and evolving from them. So these are key opportunities to build resilience. And you don't want to send the message that you don't think your kid can handle it, or sort of hamper that growth and development. And this, it can be a balance, but that's where that attunement part really comes in handy, as being able to see, what happens when I jump in and do this. How does my kid respond? You can always model and scaffold coping. And what I mean by that is kind of modeling your own, like, if you are dealing with a loss in the family, like, hey, I was really thinking about dad today, and this thing made me sad. And so I went and I looked at some pictures of him and remembered some fun moments, and I was still sad, but this is how I'm feeling with it. So that ability to kind of model or talk aloud, if you're concerned that your child is not coping effectively.
Yeah, and with the stress is within the window of tolerance, it's really important, because distress tolerance in and of itself is a skill that we want all of our youth to have, and all of our youth to be able to know that bad things will happen and we can survive them. And so creating a space where you can be outside of it and kind of hold and monitor and know that, and like almost like I'm outside, I'm watching you play outside, kind of an image of like I can still see that you are in the real world and you have these stressors, and I'm still here when you need me is very important. So like Julia said, not jumping in and rescuing too soon, because that distress tolerance skill is crucial.
Yeah, but being that kind of secure base that they can come back to.
Mhm.
Yeah, and reaffirming that. A major part of healing from loss and healing from trauma is making meaning or making sense of what happened. So, as we were talking about, trauma can sort of distort a person's beliefs around themselves and the world and others as being unsafe or unworthy or bad. And so, helping your child make meaning of the experience. It's a more kind of healthier, adaptive meaning making, kind of like Karina just said, bad things happen, but that doesn't mean that the world is bad or
Mhm.
unsafe, right? And there are things that I can do to protect myself. And what that looks like in the context of healing from loss is making meaning of the person's life and what you are going to take forward with you, the sort of legacy or how you're going to honor that person and how you're going to keep them alive with you moving through. Those types of meaning making experiences are super important and just, critical in terms of healing from trauma and loss. Another example of this might be, um, someone who's experienced sexual assault may make meaning of the experience, not in the sense of like, oh, everything happens for a reason, or I'm glad that happened to me, or that needed to happen to me, but more so, joining sexual assault survivor advocacy groups and or someone who's lost someone to suicide, dedicating part of their time to suicide prevention and awareness. Those types of ways of making meaning of an experience. Some people it is helpful to hear everything happens for a reason, but that's not the way that everyone makes meaning of the experience. So helping your child make meaning of their experience in a way that aligns with sort of who they are and your family culture, all of that is very, very important.
Yeah, and I think another way to say making meaning is what we have said a little earlier, which is integrating. So being able to integrate the loss or the traumatic event into um, life in a way that does feel meaningful. Not so much as explaining it away or making it have like a this happens for a reason, or if this didn't happen, then I wouldn't have XYZ. And again, that can be comforting for some people, and I think that um, ensuring that the loss isn't what is taking over the teen or the child, and instead is a part of who they are, because it will, as Julia mentioned earlier, it will be with them and they will carry it.
Then the last piece here that we've sort of touched on a little bit, but if the trauma or loss has personally affected the adults or the family system, being self-attuned, right? So being mindful of how you are doing. For parents who have lost a co-parent, this can be especially critical. The amount of responsibility that you're taking on of healing yourself and healing your children, like that's just too much for any one person to do, in addition to everything else. And so, really making sure that you yourself have shored up your own resources, and that you're asking for help from other, members of the community, whether that's family, friends, or other supportive adults in your sphere, or in your community. That's really important as well. So, making sure that you have that kind of oxygen mask metaphor. If you are not breathing, then you're not able to help your child put their oxygen mask on. And so, being really mindful of what your own needs are and um, what you need in order to be able to show up mindfully for your own child. That's very important.
Yeah, and to reiterate that model, you as a parent, as a caregiver, um, as somebody who cares for this teen or child in front of you, your model has so much more of a lasting impact. And so a youth watching you put your oxygen mask on first is only going to reiterate to them how important it is, um, which increases the likelihood that, when they're in your shoes, they'll also put on their oxygen mask first before they help others, which is crucial. So this slide is kind of a combination of all the things that we have already talked about. The difference between adaptive processing and maladaptive processing. What we talked about just now, what Julia highlighted so beautifully, is the top section. So healthy processing and healthy thoughts. this is just, I'm a very visual person. So this is a way that I can visually make sense of what we presented to you so far. A healthy processing, as we mentioned, is an awareness, regulation, and integration. I wanted to talk a little bit about regulation. We've talked about it. We've said, name your feelings. There is a study that happened, it came out of UCLA, and it kind of coined Dan Siegel, he's a research psychologist, term name it to tame it. And so I kind of wanted to explain what this is. The research study had two different groups. Both groups were terrified of spiders, they hated spiders, and each group was connected to like all of these biological stems, like on their heads, their heart rate, their blood pressure, to kind of measure stress and to figure out how stressed out they were when they were around these spiders. So it was like an exposure, a research exposure, yeah. And group A, everybody is monitored the same. Group A was placed in a room with spiders and not allowed to say anything. And group B was told the opposite. So they had to be in a room with spiders and they had to say everything they were feeling. If they were scared, if their heart was racing. And what came out of this study was that the people in group B, the people who were naming their feelings, their physiological response was actually like less stressful than group A. And in group B, they actually were able to move towards the spiders and touch the spiders. And so when we're talking about grief and trauma and healthy processing, naming it to tame our feelings is very important. Um, some nuance, right? Because we just talked about kids jumping in, jumping out, teens being avoidant, but just having this as a parent, right? And when we're thinking about your own oxygen mask of like, how do I then regulate my own? And sometimes a kid just needs to hear, I'm with you. I feel it too. And it's regulation for both of you, so it's a win-win. Um, then when we're talking about healthy thoughts, this is more of that cortex, if we're going back to the hand model of the brain. When you have regulation, when you're not in survival mode, being more proactive about how do I reframe my thoughts? How do I help my kid reframe their thoughts? Changing how they think about a stressor and that changing their expectations towards a stressor. Um, being proactive about problem solving, as Julia said, like what is our plan and how are we going to flex that plan? That's very important. And then self-soothing. Um, the bottom is the maladaptive processing. So that faulty thinking, catastrophizing, meaning the worst outcome is going to happen because I experienced it before and I wasn't ready for it. Ruminating, which is I'm thinking about it all the time. I can't stop thinking about it. And then you'll see this a lot in kids overgeneralizing. So it happened once, it's going to happen again and again and again. Then the behaviors, which we've talked about before. So this is just a way of kind of encapsulating all of what we've already talked about. And again, same here with this slide, healthy grief processing, embracing the emotions, expression. One thing I really wanted to highlight on this slide, and again, I love my visuals, so you'll see the little circle of growth, integration, social connections. For healthy grief processing, one thing that I think is often overlooked is creating rituals of remembrance. So this can be on, anniversary of losses, whether it's birthdays, death days. It can be lighting a candle to fill their presence. It can be a lot of people will get tattoos. If your teen's old enough and it's okay, you want them to get a tattoo, or even getting tattoos together. And so for every family, it will look different. And I think creating rituals of remembrance is also a way, as we talked about earlier, to integrate the loss into a kid and teen's life, whether it's like drawing pictures, talking about them, etc. Um, and then the last thing that I want to highlight on this slide is postponing major changes if you can. Often in grief world, they say wait a year to make a major change because that first year is often it's more of that like acute grief. Your body is adapting to this major loss. And this can't always happen. So I put if you can postpone major changes. It is just important again to be mindful and attuned to the needs of your teen or your kid. And then this is, again, I will say it for the third time, I'm a visual person. And so this is just a picture that I enjoy of the different types of ways that grief happens. And it's different for everybody. There's pockets of peace, there's hopes and fears railway, library of meaning, etc. Um, so I thought I'd share it.
I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of finding extra help. This is a big question I think that parents often have with grief, especially, which is, how do I know if, I need to take my kid to therapy? How do I know if they need more than what I can provide for them? So we'll talk a little bit about what are the signs that you're um, in that moment where you might need to get some extra support. So one of the big things that's actually not on here is kind of like we were talking about before, if you or the family system is highly impacted by the trauma or grief in a way that is compromising your ability to do all the things we've been saying for your child because you yourself are struggling or you just have too much on your plate, then that can be a reason in and of itself, even if you're not seeing some of these like heightened trauma symptoms, to get your kid to a therapist, to just sort of outsource a little bit of this. That doesn't mean disconnect completely from your kid, obviously, but if you yourself are feeling like you need some help in supporting your kid, that's a good enough reason. But also if you're seeing some of these kind of heightened issues, so some of those more kind of significant emotional or behavioral changes in your child that aren't abating after that kind of initial aftermath, or getting worse in terms of kind of mood concerns or physical self-care, academic performance and attendance, increased risk taking, all of that stuff that we had talked about, some of those more kind of severe reactions to trauma, or some of those really kind of hallmark trauma symptoms like heightened anxiety or avoidance of things that remind them of the trauma or of the loss, worry or preoccupation, that ruminating, that kind of circular thinking without really ever coming to a conclusion or a solution, and just kind of spinning your wheels with that trauma, sort of increased trauma themes in play, or some of those really acute stress symptoms like that hypervigilance or that stress startle response or nightmares. Those are all good reasons to get some extra help. Also, if you're seeing really big changes in your child or teen's relationships, whether that's, withdrawal from loved ones or, strong resistance to support or attention from loved ones, inappropriate social behavior, or that kind of intense clinginess or distress associated with separation from their caregiver. Those are all those kind of key signs for getting some extra help. So then where do you look? So obviously, we work at Children's Program. We provide trauma services. Both Karina and I work extensively with kids and teens in processing all types of trauma, and in supporting healing from loss. We also we have had an ongoing parent support group for kids parenting children with early trauma and attachment challenges. That is something that I think we'll try to kind of get back. We've taken a brief hiatus in the fall, so I would visit our website if you're interested in that to see updated information on that. And we also have other providers here who do individual work with kids and teens in trauma. In terms of looking elsewhere, it's important to look out for these kind of key evidence-based trauma therapy models for children and teens, if you're looking for trauma treatment for your child. And I've got this whole list. We love our acronyms here in psychology. So but we've got this list here of the sort of leading evidence-based trauma therapy models that have different approaches in terms of heavier parent involvement and depending on sort of the age, PCIT, parent-child interaction therapy is more for younger kids. Whereas eye movement desensitization and reprocessing EMDR therapy is typically more used with older children and teens, although there are some modifications for younger children. And trust-based relational intervention, those TBRI, is what we do the parent support groups around, and that is aimed entirely at sort of parent coaching. So it sort of depends on what exactly you're looking for or needing, but these are this is a good list of evidence-based trauma therapy models.
And some of these too depend on need. So EMDR is often used for the more visual acute traumas. Doesn't have to be, just often is. The TFCBT at the top here, the trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy, could be a better fit for a kiddo who's a little bit more cerebral. So making sure that when you are looking for professional help, that you are asking about these modalities. As again, we've said before, like, you know your kid the best. And so maybe figuring out like, okay, would this be a good fit for my kid, and trying it out.
And then sort of the outside of the therapy models themselves, something to kind of keep in mind when you're vetting providers is making sure that there are these elements of quality child therapy involved. So involvement of parents is important. Obviously, that's going to differ in terms of what's developmentally normal, depending on how old your kid is. So younger kids have a lot more parent involvement, but teens as well, there should be parent involvement. There should be, you know, a therapist should be meeting with you and updating you and getting a lot of information from you and keeping that door of communication open. Obviously, they're going to create a private and confidential space for your kid, and they're not going to tell you the nitty-gritty details of what's talked about, but they're going to involve you. And so that's important to kind of keep in mind. The timing of trauma and grief processing is a really important element here. So it's important to have a balance in trauma therapy of making sure that a child or teen has the coping skills on board before entering into trauma processing. So we don't want to, you know, push a kid into the deep end of the swimming pool without actually teaching them how to swim first. So it's important that that your child's therapist spends that time to get to know them and assess what are the kind of resources and the coping skills they already have, and how can we bulk those up before we start talking about the trauma and processing it. But it's also important to balance that with note that anxiety and avoidance is a huge part of trauma. And, you know, grief to a certain extent can be for kids. And so making sure that your child's therapist isn't just taking forever to get started on or enabling that avoidance and anxiety to perpetuate, but having a sense of, you know, you're ready to go into this, and even though you feel scared or you don't want to go into trauma processing, I'm here with you. We're gonna do this side by side. So that kind of timing of processing is going to be individually tailored to your child. So it's not going to look the same for every kid. But it's important that those elements are present. And then again, that the therapy itself is developmentally appropriate. There's going to be a lot more play therapy involved with younger kids. So it might seem like there's playing with dolls, or they're, you know, playing in the sandbox, or, you know, what is that, playing games or coloring, you know, art and play are, as Karina said, sort of the primary language of younger children. And so trauma therapy is going to involve that piece. Now, if your 17-year-old is just playing games for the whole time in trauma therapy, that might be a red flag for you. So making sure that your child's therapy is developmentally appropriate to their needs is an important aspect as well. And then the last thing I'll mention is the Dougie Center. They are incredible in terms of their ability to provide free and accessible resources and grief groups for children and families. So that is a if you haven't already heard about that and you are supporting a child through grief, this is that's a really important resource. They don't do individual therapy, but they do these groups and camps and have tons of resources on their website. So
Yeah, and they are located in Southeast Portland, just for location's sake. And that is our presentation. Thank you guys so much for joining and for listening. As Julia mentioned, our contact information is at the bottom. Feel free to email us if you have additional questions or comments about the presentation. We welcome that too. But we're here at your service.
And we went a little over because we tried to incorporate some kind of frequently asked questions as we went. But if you do need to ask further questions, feel free to reach out.